No, Your Honor. The facts speak for themselves. The judge nodded and began to speak. In my years on the bench, I've seen many cases like this. People who think they're above the law, who believe their wealth or status makes them untouchable. But the law is the law, and it exists for a reason. Speeding in a residential area is not just a minor offense, it's dangerous. It puts lives at risk, and it shows a blatant disregard for the safety of others. The young woman rolled her eyes again, clearly not listening. But the judge wasn't finished. However, he continued, this isn't just about a speeding ticket. It's about accountability. It's about understanding that your actions have consequences, and that no one is above the law. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then he delivered his verdict. I find you guilty of speeding and impose the maximum fine. But that's not all. You will also complete 100 hours of community service, working with organizations that help victims of reckless driving. And if I hear that you've been disrespectful or uncooperative, I will not hesitate to impose further penalties. The young woman's jaw dropped. She stared at the judge, her face a mix of shock and anger. You can't be serious, she said, her voice rising. This is insane. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is? The judge looked at her calmly. I don't care who your father is. In this courtroom, you are just another citizen who broke the law. And now, you will face the consequences. The young woman opened her mouth to argue, but her lawyer quickly grabbed her arm, whispering something in her ear. She glared at the judge but didn't say anything else. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who stepped forward to escort her out of the courtroom. As she walked out, the young woman turned back and shot the judge one last look of pure disdain. But the judge didn't flinch. He simply turned to the next case, his expression calm and composed. Outside the courtroom, the young woman was fuming. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How dare that judge treat her like that? She was used to getting her way, to people bending over backward to please her. This was a slap in the face, and she wasn't going to take it lying down. But as she stormed out of the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. For the first time in her life, she had been held accountable for her actions. And deep down, she knew that this wasn't the end of it. The judge's words had struck a chord, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the judge took a moment to collect his thoughts. He had seen many people like her over the years, people who thought they were untouchable, who believed their wealth and status made them immune to the law. But he also knew that the law was there for a reason. It was there to protect people, to ensure fairness, and to hold everyone accountable, no matter who they were. As he prepared for the next case, he couldn't help but hope that the young woman would learn something from this experience. Maybe, just maybe, she would realize that the world didn't revolve around her, and that her actions had consequences. But only time would tell. For now, the courtroom was quiet again, the tension from the previous case slowly fading. The judge took a deep breath and called for the next case, ready to do his job once more. Because at the end of the day, that's what it was all about: justice, fairness, and the rule of law. And no matter how many people tried to challenge it, he would always stand firm. The young woman stormed out of the courthouse, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her face was flushed with anger, and her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She dialed a number, her voice sharp and demanding as soon as the call connected. "You won't believe what just happened to me," she snapped, not bothering with a greeting. "That judge, he humiliated me. I need you to fix this. Now." On the other end of the line, her father sighed. He was used to these kinds of calls. His daughter had always been headstrong, and her sense of entitlement had only grown over the years. But this time, her tone was different. There was a hint of desperation beneath the anger, something he hadn't heard before. "Calm down," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me what happened." She recounted the events in the courtroom, her voice rising with every word. "He fined me, Dad. And he gave me community service. Can you believe that? Me, doing community service? It's ridiculous. You need to call someone and get this overturned. I'm not doing it." Her father listened quietly, his mind racing. He knew his daughter could be difficult, but this was different. She had crossed a line, and now she was facing the consequences. Still, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had spoiled her, given her everything she ever wanted, and now she expected the world to bend to her will. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally. "But you need to be careful. Judges don't take kindly to being disrespected." She rolled her eyes, even though he couldn't see her. "Whatever. Just fix it." She hung up without waiting for a response, shoving her phone back into her bag. She didn't have time for lectures. She needed to figure out how to get out of this mess. Meanwhile, the judge was finishing up his day in the courtroom. As the last case wrapped up, he leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just the young woman's case that had been draining, it was the constant battle against entitlement, the struggle to make people understand that the law applied to everyone, no matter who they were. As he gathered his things and headed out of the courthouse, he couldn't help but think about the young woman. She was just one of many, but there was something about her that stuck with him. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, with such disdain and disrespect. Or maybe it was the way she had spoken, as if the world owed her something. Whatever it was, he knew she wasn't going to let this go easily. The next morning, the young woman woke up still fuming. She had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She couldn't believe the judge had treated her like that. Who did he think he was? She was used to people bending over backward to please her, not the other way around. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She called her lawyer, demanding a meeting. When they met later that day, she didn't waste any time. "I want to appeal the verdict," she said, her voice firm. "There's no way I'm doing community service. It's beneath me." Her lawyer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Appealing a verdict isn't that simple," he said carefully. The judge was well within his rights to impose the sentence he did. And given the way you behaved in court, it's not going to be easy to argue that he was unfair. She glared at him. "I'm not paying you to tell me it's not easy. I'm paying you to fix this. So fix it." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll look into it. But I need you to understand that this might not go the way you want it to. Judges don't take kindly to being challenged, especially when they've already made their decision." She waved a hand dismissively. "Just do your job." As the days passed, the young woman tried to go about her life as usual, but the verdict hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way the judge had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her. It infuriated her, but it also made her uneasy. For the first time in her life, she had been held accountable for her actions, and it was a feeling she didn't like. Meanwhile, the judge was dealing with his own thoughts. He had seen many people like the young woman over the years, but there was something about her that stayed with him. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, with such disdain and disrespect. Or maybe it was the way she had spoken, as if the world owed her something. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. A few days later, the young woman's lawyer called her with an update. "I've looked into the appeal," he said, his tone cautious. "But I have to be honest with you, it's not looking good. The judge's decision was solid, and unless we can find some kind of procedural error, there's not much we can do." She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "So what are you saying? That I just have to accept this?" He sighed. "I'm saying that fighting this might not be worth it. Sometimes it's better to just move on." She hung up without responding, her mind racing. She wasn't going to just move on. She couldn't. This wasn't just about the fine or the community service, it was about principle. She wasn't going to let some judge humiliate her and get away with it. That night, she sat down at her computer and started researching. She was going to find a way to fight this, no matter what it took. She spent hours scrolling through legal forums, reading about appeals and court procedures. She even found a few articles about the judge, trying to dig up anything she could use against him. As she read, she came across a story that caught her attention. It was about a case the judge had presided over a few years ago, where he had made a controversial decision. The details were vague, but it was enough to give her an idea. Maybe, just maybe, she could use this to her advantage. The next morning, she called her lawyer again. "I want you to look into this case," she said, sending him the link. "If we can find something on the judge, maybe we can use it to get the verdict overturned." Her lawyer hesitated. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But I need you to understand that this is a risky move. If the judge finds out you're digging into his past, it could backfire." She didn't care. She was willing to take the risk. She wasn't going to let this go, not until she got what she wanted. Meanwhile, the judge was going about his usual routine, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. He had no idea that the young woman was digging into his past, looking for anything she could use against him. But even if he had known, he wouldn't have been worried. He had spent his career upholding the law, and he had nothing to hide. As the days turned into weeks, the young woman became more determined. She wasn't going to let this go, not until she got what she wanted. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The judge's words had struck a chord, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. And as much as she wanted to fight, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. But for now, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had a plan, and she was going to see it through. No matter what it took. The young woman's determination to fight the judge's verdict only grew stronger as the days passed. She spent hours online, scouring legal forums and articles, looking for any loophole or weakness she could exploit. Her lawyer, though hesitant, continued to assist her, knowing she wouldn't back down. But as they dug deeper, they found nothing substantial to challenge the judge's decision. The verdict was solid, and the judge's reputation was impeccable. Frustration began to set in, but she refused to give up. One evening, as she sat in her lavish apartment, scrolling through yet another legal website, she came across a comment that caught her attention. It was from someone who claimed to have been in the judge's courtroom years ago. The comment mentioned how the judge had once shown leniency to a young offender, giving them a second chance instead of imposing a harsh sentence. The commenter described it as a moment of compassion, something that had stuck with them over the years. The young woman frowned as she read it. Compassion? That didn't sound like the judge she had encountered. The man who had humiliated her in court didn't seem capable of compassion. But something about the comment nagged at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the judge than she had seen. The next day, she decided to do something she had never done before. She went back to the courthouse. Not to fight her case, but to observe. She wanted to see the judge in action, to understand what made him tick. She dressed casually, hoping to blend in with the crowd, and took a seat in the back of the courtroom. As the cases were called, she watched the judge closely. He was calm and composed, listening carefully to each person who stood before him. She noticed how he treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. When a young man, barely out of his teens, stood before him for a petty theft charge, the judge didn't immediately impose a sentence. Instead, he asked questions. He wanted to understand why the young man had stolen, what had led him to that point. The young woman leaned forward, intrigued. The judge's tone was firm but not unkind. He spoke to the young man as if he genuinely cared about his future. "You're young," the the judge said. You have your whole life ahead of you. But the choices you make now will shape that life. Do you understand that? The young man nodded, his head hanging low. Yes, sir, he mumbled. The judge paused, then delivered his verdict. I'm going to give you a chance to turn things around. Instead of jail time, you'll complete community service and attend counseling. But if I see you back in this courtroom, the consequences will be much more severe. Do you understand? The young man looked up, surprised. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The young woman sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't the judge she had expected to see. Where was the harsh, unyielding man who had humiliated her? This judge was patient, thoughtful, even compassionate. It didn't make sense. As the day went on, she saw more examples of the judge's fairness. He was strict when he needed to be, but he also showed understanding and empathy. He seemed to genuinely care about the people who stood before him, even when they didn't deserve it. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, and it left her feeling conflicted. That evening, she called her lawyer again. I need you to find out more about the judge, she said. Not just his case. That evening, she called her lawyer again. I need you to find out more about the judge, she said. Not just his cases, but his background. Who is he? What's his story? Her lawyer hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea, he said carefully. Digging into a judge's personal life could backfire. It might even be seen as harassment. She clenched her fists, frustration bubbling up. I don't care. I need to know. There's something about him, something I'm missing. Just do it. Reluctantly, her lawyer agreed. Over the next few days, he gathered what information he could. The judge, it turned out, had grown up in a rough neighborhood. He had faced his own struggles as a young man, including run-ins with the law. But instead of letting those experiences define him, he had used them as motivation to change his life. He had worked hard, put himself through law school, and eventually become a judge. His reputation was one of fairness and integrity, and he was widely respected in the legal community. When the young woman heard this, she was silent for a long time. She had expected to find something she could use against him, some flaw or weakness. Instead, she found a story of resilience and redemption. It was the last thing she had expected, and it left her feeling unsettled. The next day, she returned to the courthouse again. This time, she wasn't sure what she was looking for. She just knew she needed to see more. As she watched the judge handle case after case, she began to see a pattern. He wasn't just enforcing the law, he was trying to make a difference. He gave second chances to those who seemed willing to change, but he was firm with those who showed no remorse. It was a delicate balance, one that required wisdom and discernment. By the end of the day, the young woman felt a strange sense of clarity. She still didn't like the judge, she couldn't forget how he had humiliated her, but she was beginning to understand him. And that understanding made her uncomfortable. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in her life, she questioned herself. Had she been wrong? Had she crossed a line? The judge's words echoed in her mind, the law applies to everyone, regardless of who you are or how much money you have. She had always believed that rules were for other people, that her wealth and status made her untouchable. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, she made a decision. She called her lawyer and told him to stop the appeal. I'm going to do the community service, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Her lawyer was surprised. Are you sure? We might still have a chance to fight this. She shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. No. It's time to face the consequences. As she hung up the phone, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in her life, she was taking responsibility for her actions. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't what she wanted, but it felt right. The next day, she showed up at the community service center. It was a far cry from the luxurious lifestyle she was used to, but she was determined to see it through. As she worked alongside people from all walks of life, she began to see the world in a new way. These were people who didn't have the privileges she had, who had to work hard just to get by. And yet, they were kind, resilient, and full of hope. It was a humbling experience, one that challenged everything she had ever believed. And as the days turned into weeks, she began to change. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom, full of arrogance and entitlement. She was starting to understand what it meant to be accountable, to care about others, to be part of something bigger than herself. Meanwhile, the judge continued his work, unaware of the impact he had had on the young woman. He had no idea that his words and actions had sparked a transformation in her, that she was beginning to see the world, and herself, in a new light. But even if he had known, he wouldn't have taken credit. For him, it was just another day in the pursuit of justice. And so, the story continued, a tale of arrogance and accountability, of judgment and redemption. It was a reminder that the law is not just about punishment, it's about fairness, understanding, and the possibility of change. And for the young woman, it was the beginning of a journey she never saw coming. The young woman's first few days of community service were anything but easy. She was assigned to work at a local food bank, sorting donations and packing boxes for families in need. The work was physically demanding, and the environment was a far cry from the luxury she was accustomed to. The other volunteers were friendly, but she kept to herself, still grappling with the reality of her situation. At first, she approached the work with resentment. She couldn't believe she had been reduced to this, her, of all people, doing manual labor alongside strangers. But as the days went by, something began to shift. She started to notice the people around her, not just as volunteers, but as individuals with their own stories. There was an older woman who came in every day, always with a smile, despite the fact that she was clearly struggling to make ends meet. There was a young man who had been in and out of trouble but was now trying to turn his life around. And there were families who came to pick up food, their faces etched with gratitude. One day, as she was sorting through a box of canned goods, the older woman struck up a conversation. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked kindly. The young woman nodded, unsure of how much to share. "Yeah, I'm just helping out for a while." The older woman smiled. "That's good of you. It's not easy work, but it's worth it. You're making a difference, you know." The young woman hesitated, then asked, "Why do you do this? I mean, you're here every day. Don't you have other things to do?" The older woman chuckled. "Oh, I've got plenty to do. But this is important. These people, they're not just strangers. They're my neighbors, my community. And if I can help make their lives a little easier, even in a small way, then it's worth it." The young woman was silent for a moment, processing the woman's words. She had never thought about it that way before. To her, the world had always been divided into two categories: people like her, who had everything, and everyone else, who didn't matter. But here, in this small food bank, she was starting to see things differently. As the weeks went by, she began to open up more. She started talking to the other volunteers, asking them about their lives. She learned that many of them had faced challenges far greater than anything she had ever experienced. Some had lost jobs, others had struggled with addiction, and some were just trying to make ends meet. But despite their hardships, they were kind, resilient, and full of hope. One day, a young mother came in with her 2 children to pick up food. The children were quiet, their eyes wide as they looked around the room. The young woman watched as the mother filled a box with groceries, her hands trembling slightly. When she reached for a can of soup, it slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. Without thinking, the young woman hurried over and picked it up. "Here you go," she said, handing the can back to the mother. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's been a tough week." The young woman hesitated, then asked, "Is there anything else you need? Anything I can do to help?" The mother shook her head. "No, this is enough. Thank you." As the woman and her children left, the young woman felt a strange ache in her chest. She had never felt that kind of gratitude before, not from someone else, and certainly not from herself. It was a humbling feeling, one that made her realize how much she had taken for granted. That evening, she went home and sat alone in her apartment, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of purpose. She had spent so much of her life chasing after things, money, status, attention, but none of it had ever made her feel like this. Helping others, even in a small way, had given her a sense of fulfillment she had never known. The next day, she returned to the food bank with a new determination. She threw herself into the work, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She started arriving early and staying late, doing whatever she could to help. The other volunteers noticed the change in her, and they welcomed her with open arms. One afternoon, as she was packing boxes, the older woman approached her again. "You've been working hard," she said with a smile. "It's good to see." The young woman smiled back. "Thanks. I'm just trying to do my part." The older woman nodded. "You know, when I first started coming here, I was in a pretty dark place. I had lost my job, and I didn't know how I was going to make it. But being here, helping others, it gave me a reason to keep going. It reminded me that no matter how bad things get, there's always something you can do to make a difference." The young woman listened quietly, her heart heavy with emotion. She had never thought about it that way before. For her, community service had been a punishment, something to endure and get through. But now, she was starting to see it as an opportunity, a chance to grow, to learn, and to give back. As the weeks turned into months, the young woman continued to volunteer at the food bank. She didn't just show up, she became an integral part of the team. She organized donation drives, helped with fundraising events, and even started mentoring some of the younger volunteers. It was a side of her she had never known existed, and it filled her with a sense of pride she had never felt before. Meanwhile, the judge continued his work in the courtroom, unaware of the transformation taking place in the young woman's life. He had no idea that his verdict had set her on a path of self-discovery and growth. But even if he had known, he wouldn't have taken credit. For him, it was just another day in the pursuit of justice. And so, the story continued, a tale of arrogance and accountability, of judgment and redemption. It was a reminder that the law is not just about punishment, it's about fairness, understanding, and the possibility of change. And for the young woman, it was the beginning of a journey she never saw coming. As she stood in the food bank one afternoon, surrounded by people who had become like family, she realized how far she had come. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom, full of arrogance and entitlement. She was someone new, someone who had learned the value of humility, compassion, and community. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly proud of who she was. The young woman's transformation didn't go unnoticed. The volunteers at the food bank, who had once seen her as aloof and distant, now regarded her as one of their own. She had become a reliable presence, someone who could be counted on to show up, work hard, and lend a hand wherever it was needed. But more than that, she had become a friend, a person who listened, cared, and genuinely wanted to make a difference. One day, as she was organizing a new shipment of donations, the older woman who had first spoken to her approached with a smile. "You've really found your place here, haven't you?" she said warmly. The young woman paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think so," she replied, her voice tinged with a quiet pride. "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually look forward to coming here. It feels like I'm doing something that matters." The older woman nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "That's the thing about helping others. It changes you. It reminds you that we're all connected, that we all have a role to play in making the world a little better." The young woman smiled, but her thoughts drifted to the judge. She hadn't seen him since that day in court, but his words still echoed in her mind. He had been the one to set her on this path, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now, if he would even recognize the person she had become. As the weeks went by, her work at the food bank began to expand. She started taking on more responsibilities, organizing events and reaching out to local businesses for donations. Her natural charisma and determination made her a natural leader, and the other volunteers quickly rallied behind her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a fundraising event, she received a call from her father. She hadn't spoken to him much since the court case, and she wasn't sure what to expect. "Hey," she said cautiously as she answered the phone. "Hey," her father replied, his tone neutral. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time at that food bank. Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then said, "Yeah, everything's fine. I've just been keeping busy." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I see. Well, I just wanted to check in. You know, make sure you're doing all right." She smiled faintly. "I'm doing better than all right, actually. I've been helping out here, and it's been really good for me." Her father was silent for a moment, then said, "That's good to hear. I'm proud of you, you know." The words caught her off guard. Her father had never been one to express his emotions openly, and hearing him say he was proud of her meant more than she could put into words. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly. "That means a lot." After the call, she sat for a moment, reflecting on how much had changed. Her relationship with her father, once strained by her entitled behavior, was slowly healing. And her own sense of self-worth, once tied to material possessions and social status, was now rooted in something far more meaningful. The fundraising event she had been organizing was a success. Local businesses donated generously, and the community turned out in full force to show their support. As she stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd, she felt a surge of pride, not for herself, but for the work they had all done together. "This isn't just about food," she said, her voice steady and confident. "It's about hope. It's about showing people that they're not alone, that we're here for them. And that's something worth fighting for." The room erupted in applause, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was making a real difference. But even as she celebrated the success of the event, she couldn't shake the thought of the judge. She wanted him to know how much his verdict had changed her life, not just as a punishment, but as a turning point. She wanted to thank him, to show him that his belief in accountability and fairness had not been in vain. A few days later, she mustered the courage to visit the courthouse. She wasn't sure what she would say or even if she would be able to speak to him, but she knew she had to try. As she walked through the familiar halls, her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't been back since that fateful day, and the memories came flooding back. When she reached the courtroom, she paused outside the door, taking a deep breath. She could hear the judge's voice inside, calm and authoritative as ever. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside and took a seat in the back of the room. The judge was presiding over a case, his demeanor as composed as she remembered. She watched him closely, noticing the way he listened intently to each person who stood before him. There was a kindness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a patience that spoke of years of experience and wisdom. When the session ended, she waited as the room emptied. The judge gathered his papers and stood, preparing to leave. As he turned toward the door, he noticed her sitting in the back. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. She stood, her heart racing, and walked toward him. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know if you remember me, but—" "I remember you," he interrupted gently. "How could I forget?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For what you did. For holding me accountable. It changed my life." The judge studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "I'm glad to hear that. Accountability isn't always easy, but it's necessary. It's how we grow." She smiled faintly. "I understand that now. And I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at a food bank. It's been really good for me. I've learned a lot." The judge's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a hint of a smile. "That's good to hear. The law isn't just about punishment, it's about giving people the chance to change, to make amends. It sounds like you've done that." She nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I'm trying. And I wanted to thank you for giving me that chance." The judge regarded her for a moment, then said, "You're welcome. But remember, this is just the beginning. Keep going. Keep growing. And don't forget the lessons you've learned." She nodded again, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I won't. Thank you, Your Honor." As she left the courthouse that day, she felt a sense of closure. The judge's words had given her the validation she hadn't realized she needed, but more than that, they had reminded her of the importance of accountability and growth. She wasn't the same person she had been, and she never would be again. And as she walked back to the food bank, ready to continue her work, she knew that this was just the beginning of her journey. She had found her purpose, and she was determined to make the most of it. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The young woman's visit to the courthouse had left her with a renewed sense of purpose. The judge's words, simple yet profound, had resonated deeply with her. She realized that her journey wasn't just about completing her community service or proving something to others. It was about becoming the kind of person she could be proud of, someone who contributed to the world in a meaningful way. Back at the food bank, she threw herself into her work with even more determination. She began to take on larger projects, like coordinating with local schools to provide meals for children in need and organizing workshops to teach people basic cooking skills. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. The community began to see her not as the spoiled rich girl she once was, but as a dedicated volunteer who genuinely cared about making a difference. One day, as she was setting up for a workshop, a young boy approached her. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his clothes slightly too big and his shoes worn at the edges. "Are you the one who's teaching us how to cook?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. She smiled and crouched down to his level. "That's me. Are you excited to learn?" He nodded eagerly. "Yeah. My mom says if I learn how to cook, I can help her make dinner. She works a lot, so it's hard for her to do everything." Her heart ached at his words, but she kept her smile steady. "That's really nice of you to want to help your mom. Cooking can be a lot of fun, and it's a great way to show people you care." As the workshop began, she found herself connecting with the kids in a way she hadn't expected. They were eager to learn, full of energy and curiosity, and their enthusiasm was contagious. By the end of the session, they were proudly showing off the simple dishes they had made, their faces beaming with pride. After the workshop, the boy from earlier came up to her again, holding a slightly lopsided sandwich. "I made this for my mom," he said, holding it out to her. "Do you think she'll like it?" She knelt down and looked at the sandwich, her heart swelling with emotion. "I think she'll love it," she said softly. "Because you made it with love. That's the most important ingredient." The boy grinned and ran off to pack his creation carefully into a container. As she watched him go, she felt a surge of gratitude. This was what it was all about, not just helping people, but empowering them, giving them the tools to take control of their lives. Her work at the food bank began to attract attention beyond the local community. A reporter from a small newspaper heard about her efforts and reached out to interview her. At first, she was hesitant. She didn't want the spotlight, she just wanted to help. But the reporter assured her that sharing her story could inspire others to get involved, so she agreed. The interview was published a week later, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over the city reached out to volunteer, donate, or simply express their gratitude. The food bank saw a surge in support, and the young woman found herself at the center of a growing movement. But with the attention came challenges. Some people questioned her motives, accusing her of using her volunteer work as a way to rehabilitate her image. Others dug up her past, reminding the world of the spoiled rich girl who had mocked a judge in court. The criticism stung, but she refused to let it deter her. She knew who she was and why she was doing this, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as she was sorting through donations, the older woman who had become a mentor to her approached. "I saw the article," she said, her tone gentle. "How are you holding up?" The young woman sighed, setting down the box she was holding. "It's a lot. I didn't expect this kind of attention. I just wanted to help." The older woman nodded. "I know. But when you put yourself out there, people are going to talk. The important thing is to stay true to yourself. You know why you're doing this, and that's what matters." She smiled faintly. "Thanks. I needed to hear that." The older woman patted her shoulder. "You're doing good work. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." As the weeks went by, the young woman continued to focus on her work, letting her actions speak for themselves. She organized more workshops, expanded the food bank's outreach programs, and even started a mentorship initiative to help young people in the community develop life skills. Her efforts were making a tangible difference, and the criticism began to fade as people saw the impact she was having. One day, she received an unexpected visitor at the food bank. It was the judge. She was in the middle of organizing a donation drive when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly wiped her hands on her apron before walking over to him. "Your Honor," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here?" The judge smiled faintly. "I heard about the work you've been doing. I wanted to see it for myself." She nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and pride. "Well, this is it. We're just trying to help as many people as we can." He looked around the room, taking in the bustling activity. Volunteers were sorting donations, packing boxes, and preparing meals, their faces filled with determination and purpose. "It's impressive," he said finally. "You've built something remarkable here." She smiled, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. "Thank you. It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it." The judge turned to her, his expression serious. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you. It's not easy to change, to take responsibility for your actions and turn them into something positive. But you've done that, and it's made a difference." Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot." He nodded, then said, "Keep going. The world needs more people like you." As he turned to leave, she felt a surge of gratitude. His words were a reminder of how far she had come, but also of how much further she had to go. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. That evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had started this journey as a punishment, but it had become so much more. It had become a chance to grow, to learn, and to give back. And as she looked toward the future, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the community she had come to love. The young woman who had once mocked a judge in court was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who understood the value of accountability, compassion, and hard work. And as she closed her eyes that night, she knew that this was just the beginning. Her journey was far from over, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The young woman's work at the food bank continued to grow, and so did her reputation. What had started as a personal journey of redemption had blossomed into something much larger. She was no longer just a volunteer, she had become a leader, a voice for the community, and a symbol of change. People who had once doubted her now looked to her for inspiration, and she embraced the role with humility and determination. One of her most ambitious projects was a partnership with local farmers to provide fresh produce to families in need. She had noticed that many of the food bank's donations were non-perishable items, which were essential but lacked the nutritional value of fresh fruits and vegetables. She reached out to farmers in the area, proposing a collaboration that would benefit everyone. The farmers would have a reliable outlet for their produce, and the food bank would be able to offer healthier options to the community. The initiative was a success, and soon the food bank was receiving regular shipments of fresh produce. The young woman organized cooking classes to teach people how to prepare the ingredients, ensuring that nothing went to waste. The community responded enthusiastically, and the program became a model for other food banks in the region. But with success came new challenges. The increased demand for fresh produce meant that the food bank needed more resources, more storage space, more volunteers, and more funding. The young woman found herself spending long hours writing grant proposals, meeting with potential donors, and coordinating logistics. It was exhausting work, but she refused to give up. She had seen the impact the program was having, and she was determined to keep it going. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, she received a call from her father. "I heard about your partnership with the farmers," he said, his tone warm with pride. "That's quite an accomplishment." She smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Thanks, Dad. It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it. We're helping so many people." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe I could help. I have some connections in the agricultural industry. I could reach out, see if anyone's interested in supporting your program." Her eyes widened in surprise. Her father had always been supportive in his own way, but he had never taken an active interest in her work before. "That would be amazing," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't mention it," he replied. "I'm proud of you, you know. You've come a long way." The call left her feeling energized and hopeful. With her father's help, she was able to secure additional funding and resources for the food bank. The program continued to grow, and the young woman found herself at the center of a thriving community initiative. But as much as she enjoyed the work, she couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on her. The long hours and constant pressure were beginning to wear her down. She found herself feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, struggling to balance her responsibilities at the food bank with her personal life. One day, as she was rushing to prepare for a meeting, the older woman who had become her mentor pulled her aside. "You need to slow down," she said gently. "You're doing amazing work, but you can't keep going at this pace. You'll burn out." The young woman sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know. But there's so much to do, and I don't want to let anyone down." The older woman placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not going to let anyone down by taking care of yourself. In fact, you'll be a better leader if you're well-rested and healthy. You can't pour from an empty cup." Her words struck a chord, and the young woman realized she was right. She had been so focused on helping others that she had neglected her own needs. She decided to take a step back, delegating some of her responsibilities and making time for self-care. It wasn't easy. She was used to being in control, to handling everything herself. But as she began to share the workload, she discovered a new sense of freedom. The other volunteers stepped up, taking on more responsibility and showing her that she didn't have to do it all alone. With more time to herself, she began to explore other ways to give back to the community. She started a mentorship program for at-risk youth, pairing them with volunteers who could offer guidance and support. She also began speaking at local schools and community centers, sharing her story and encouraging others to get involved. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. One day, she received an invitation to speak at a regional conference on community development. It was a huge opportunity, and she felt both excited and nervous. She had never spoken in front of such a large audience before, but she knew it was a chance to spread her message and inspire others. The day of the conference arrived, and she stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was there. This wasn't about her, it was about the work she was doing, the people she was helping, and the change she was trying to create. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. She smiled, feeling a surge of confidence. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "A few years ago, I never would have imagined standing here, talking to all of you. I was a very different person back then, selfish, entitled, and completely unaware of the struggles that so many people face every day." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But life has a way of humbling you. For me, it was a judge who held me accountable for my actions. At the time, I hated him for it. But now, I realize that he gave me a gift, the gift of perspective. He showed me that the world is bigger than my own problems, that there are people out there who need help, and that I have the power to make a difference." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. She continued, sharing the story of her journey, the challenges, the setbacks, and the triumphs. She talked about the food bank, the partnerships she had built, and the lives she had touched. And she ended with a call to action, urging everyone in the room to find their own way to give back. When she finished, the room erupted in applause once more. She felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was what it was all about, not just helping others, but inspiring them to do the same. As she left the stage, she was approached by several people who wanted to thank her or ask questions. One of them was a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. "Your story really resonated with me," she said, her eyes shining with emotion. "I've been struggling lately, feeling like I don't have a purpose. But hearing you talk about your journey, it gave me hope. Thank you." The young woman smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. "You're welcome," she said softly. "And remember, it's never too late to start making a difference. Just take it one step at a time." As she walked away from the conference that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey was far from over, but she knew she was on the right path. She had found her calling, and she was determined to keep going, not just for herself, but for the community she had come to love. And as she looked toward the future, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the world. Change was possible, one person at a time. And she was ready to be a part of it. The young woman's life had become a whirlwind of activity, but it was a whirlwind she welcomed. Her work at the food bank, her mentorship programs, and her public speaking engagements kept her busy, but they also filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She had found her calling, and she was determined to make the most of it. One day, as she was preparing for a community event, she received a letter in the mail. It was from the courthouse. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at a ceremony honoring the judge who had presided over her case. The event was meant to celebrate his years of service and his commitment to justice and fairness. She stared at the letter, her mind racing. The judge had been the catalyst for her transformation, the one who had held her accountable and set her on this path. The idea of speaking at his ceremony was both intimidating and deeply meaningful. She knew she had to do it. The day of the ceremony arrived, and she found herself standing in front of a room filled with judges, lawyers, and community leaders. The judge sat at the front of the room, his expression calm and composed as always. She took a deep breath, stepped up to the podium, and began to speak. "A few years ago, I stood in front of this man," she said, gesturing to the judge, "and I was not at my best. I was arrogant, entitled, and completely unaware of the impact my actions had on others. When he held me accountable, I was angry. I thought he was being unfair, that he didn't understand me. But the truth is, he understood me better than I understood myself." She paused, letting her words sink in. That day in court was a turning point for me. It was the day I realized that the world doesn't revolve around me, that my actions have consequences, and that I have a responsibility to do better. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but it was a necessary one. And I'm grateful for it. The room was silent, everyone listening intently. She continued, her voice steady and sincere. "Since that day, I've tried to live my life differently. I've worked to give back to my community, to help those in need, and to be a better person. And while I still have a long way to go, I know that I'm on the right path. And I owe that to him." She turned to the judge, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Your Honor, thank you for believing in accountability, for showing me that the law isn't just about punishment, it's about fairness, understanding, and the possibility of change. You've made a difference in my life, and I know you've made a difference in the lives of countless others. Thank you." The room erupted in applause, and she saw the judge smile, a genuine, heartfelt smile that filled her with warmth. As she stepped down from the podium, he stood and approached her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That meant a lot." She nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "No, thank you. You changed my life." The ceremony continued, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt a sense of closure, a feeling that she had come full circle. The journey that had begun in that courtroom had led her here, to a place of growth, understanding, and purpose. And as she looked around the room, she realized how far she had come. In the weeks that followed, she continued her work with renewed energy. The food bank was thriving, her mentorship programs were making a difference, and her public speaking engagements were inspiring others to get involved. She had become a leader in her community, someone people looked up to and admired. But she never forgot where she had started. She made a point of visiting the courthouse regularly, not to fight a case, but to offer support to others who were struggling. She volunteered with organizations that help young people navigate the legal system, sharing her story and offering guidance. She wanted to be the kind of person the judge had been for her, someone who believed in accountability, but also in the possibility of change. One day, as she was leaving the courthouse, she ran into the young woman she had met at the conference. She looked different, more confident, more hopeful. "Hey," the young woman said with a smile. "I just wanted to thank you again. Your story really inspired me, and I've been volunteering at the food bank ever since. It's changed my life." The young woman smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." The young woman nodded. "I just wanted you to know that you're making a difference. Not just for the people at the food bank, but for people like me. You've shown me that it's never too late to change, to start over. And that means everything." Her words stayed with her long after they parted ways. She realized that her journey wasn't just about her own growth, it was about inspiring others to grow, too. She had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that change was possible, no matter where you started. As she walked back to the food bank that day, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come so far, but she knew her journey wasn't over. There was still so much to do, so many people to help, so many lives to touch. And she was ready for it. The young woman who had once mocked a judge in court was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who understood the value of accountability, compassion, and hard work. She had found her purpose, and she was determined to make the most of it. And as she looked toward the future, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the world. Change was possible, one person at a time. And she was ready to be a part of it.